There are stories in the Bible that go unnoticed until we decide to look closely. At first glance, they seem like just old lists, difficult names, long genealogies, or details that are only useful for those who like to study the text in more depth. But, when observed closely, what seemed like just a historical record begins to reveal a much deeper layer. And few stories show this as powerfully as that of the tribes of Israel. What for many people is just a sequence of names, is actually a portrait of how God works with human suffering. It's as if heaven has been writing, throughout the centuries, a hidden message within the story of a wounded family. A message that begins with tears, passes through rejection, crosses conflicts, survives divisions, and ends before the presence of God, with names engraved on doors and precious stones on the chest of a priest. When people talk about the 12 tribes of Israel, almost everyone thinks of a list that needs to be memorized. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, and then most people get lost along the way. But these tribes didn't emerge as a memorization exercise. They were born within a home marked by broken affection, conflict, comparison, and waiting. Before they were territories, before they became a nation, before they appeared on maps and in prophecies, they were children. And before they were children, they were God's answers to women who carried deep sorrows. It all begins with Jacob. Jacob had fallen in love with Rachel and worked 7 years to marry her. But the biblical text shows that this time seemed too short for him, because the love he felt was intense. Even so, on the wedding night there was a mistake. Instead of Rachel, Jacob was given Leah, her older sister. He woke up beside the woman he hadn't chosen. And from that moment on, the house transforms into a scene of open wounds, disordered loves, and children who arrive as signs of a story far more complex than a simple patriarchal family. Leah was the unfavored woman. She was not chosen by Jacob's heart, and this shapes her entire early motherhood. Her first son is named Reuben, and this name carries the idea of being seen. The boy's birth is linked to God's gaze upon Leah's anguish. She realizes at that moment that the Lord observed her distress. The choice of name does not stem from triumph, but from necessity. It does not arise from conquest, but from need. Reuben becomes the first reminder that God sees what others ignore. This detail changes everything. Because the first tribe of Israel didn't spring from a king, wasn't born from a war, didn't come from an empire, nor from a military victory. It arose from the heart of a woman who felt invisible. And her son's name became a declaration: God saw me. In other words, the story of Israel begins with a woman who thought she wasn't noticed, but discovers that heaven was watching her all along. This isn't just an emotional detail. It's a spiritual foundation. Next comes Simeon. If Reuben is linked to sight, Simeon is linked to hearing. Leah realizes that God heard her pain, heard her state of scorn, heard her second wound. So she gives her second son a name that carries this answer. Simeon's very birth proclaims that God is not merely a distant observer. He also listens. He not only sees the pain, but pays attention to the cry of the one who is suffering. And this is powerful because it shows that the divine response does not come automatically or mechanically, it comes as personal attention. At this point, 2 tribes have already emerged as witnesses to something far greater than a domestic drama. They proclaim that God sees and God hears. These 2 statements together form a marvelous portrait of divine care for wounded people. The world may not heal. The family may not validate. The human heart may reject. But the Lord sees and the Lord hears. And so Levi is born. And with Levi, the story gains an even deeper layer. The name carries the idea of connection, of union, of attachment. Leah thinks, when naming her son, that perhaps now her husband would finally unite with her. But what seemed like a romantic hope ends up revealing an even greater truth. Because the descendants of Levi would not be remembered for a marital bond, but for a connection with God. The tribe of Levi would be set apart for sacred service, for the tabernacle, for the priesthood, for mediation between the people and the divine presence. It's a striking contrast. Leah longed for human closeness, but received a spiritual calling. She sought the heart of a man, and God placed her in a lineage of holy service. Her pain was not wasted. It was transformed into a calling. The name Levi, born from the hope of being linked to Jacob, ultimately points to a much greater union with God himself. And then comes Judah. Judah changes the tone of everything. Up to this point, the names of the tribes carry affliction, rejection, lack, and waiting. But in Judah, a pattern breaks. For the first time, Leah is not naming a son based on what she lacks, but on what she offers. She says, "This time I will praise the Lord." The name Judah is linked to the idea of praise, recognition, and worship. Here the narrative rises from the ground of pain and begins to breathe a different atmosphere. It doesn't mean the wound has completely disappeared, but something has changed in the heart's response. This is one of the most beautiful moments in the whole story. Leah stops seeking Jacob's validation and begins to glorify God. She no longer says, "Perhaps now I will be loved." She says in essence, "Now I will worship." And this alters the direction of the story. The biblical text shows that after this she stops conceiving for a time. But this is not a sign of abandonment. It is a sign of transition. The first children were born from pain. The fourth is born from worship. And it is precisely from the tribe of Judah that the royal lineage would come. David would come from Judah. The kingdom would be associated with Judah. And in the New Testament, Jesus is presented as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. That is, the Messiah comes from the tribe that was born at the moment when a rejected woman decided to transform her pain into praise. It's almost unbelievable to realize this. David's throne and messianic hope are rooted in a domestic history of contempt, tears, and worship that overcame resentment. Now stop and look at the four names in sequence. Reuben, God saw me. Simeon, God has heard me. Levi, God has connected me to him. Judah, I will praise the Lord. In four names there is an entire journey. From sight to hearing, from connection to worship. From the feeling of abandonment to the response of faith. It's as if the story is saying that healing doesn't happen all at once, but in stages. First God sees. Then God hears. Then God calls near. And finally the heart learns to praise. This sequence alone would be enough to transform the way someone reads Genesis. But the story is only just beginning. Because after these first four tribes, the servants of the two sisters enter the scene. And this changes the structure of Jacob's family even more. What was already a home marked by dispute becomes also a space of competition for children, prestige, and recognition. Rachel, who had not yet been able to conceive, gives her servant Bilhah to Jacob. And Bilhah begins to bear children in Rachel's name. The first of them is named Dan, linked to the idea of judgment or justice. Rachel interprets this birth as a divine response to her struggle. Dan's name speaks of justice, but the tribe's history will show that a beautiful name doesn't always guarantee a perfect path. Even so, at that moment, Dan's birth signifies that God has intervened. God has judged. God has taken a stand. God has answered. The narrative becomes more complex because the rivalry between the sisters deepens the list of births. It's not just about children. It's about a struggle for attention, for honor, and for a place within the family itself. Each birth seems to carry a phrase, a cry, a desire to be recognized. And that's exactly what gives the story its human weight. These tribes don't come from a laboratory. They come from real people full of real needs. After Dan, Naphtali is born. Naphtali carries the idea of struggle, of contention, of perseverance amidst conflict. The name itself is born with the sound of battle. And this perfectly matches the environment in which he arrives in the world. Rachel sees the competition with Leah and describes her experience in terms of struggle. Motherhood there is not only a blessing, it is also a territory of confrontation. But, at the same time, this tribe will end up linked to one of the most luminous scenarios in the entire biblical narrative. The region of Naphtali in northern Israel would later be associated with Galilee, where Jesus would begin his public ministry. That territory, which previously carried echoes of conflict, would come to be known as the place where light first shone for a people in darkness. It's a striking detail. The land that was born under the language of dispute would become the stage for the arrival of hope. It's as if God enjoys doing this. He takes places and stories marked by tension and transforms them into settings for revelation. What began as contention becomes a source of light. What began as rivalry becomes an environment for divine manifestation. And, suddenly, biblical geography itself begins to preach. Meanwhile, Leah didn't stand still. She also gives her servant, Zilpah, to Jacob. And from there more children are born, now through another layer of the same story. The first is Gad, a name associated with the idea of fortune, luck, or even the arrival of an army. The term carries a weight of advancement and strength. Gad ends up becoming associated with valiant warriors, men trained for battle, known for their courage. The tribe gains a reputation for resilience and military valor. This shows that biblical names are not just phonetic labels. They unfold into identity, trajectory, and collective character. Gad, who begins as a phrase of expectation, ends up as a symbol of bravery. The servant's son becomes the ancestor of a people who know how to fight. After Gad comes Asher. Asher is a name linked to happiness, blessing, and contentment. Leah, in naming this son, acknowledges that other women will call her happy. The name conveys a kind of rare lightness in a family so marked by emotional weight. And that's beautiful because it shows that not all the narrative is conflict. There are also signs of delight, prosperity, and future joy. Later, a woman from this tribe appears in the New Testament. Anna, a prophetess of Asher, serving in the temple and awaiting the Messiah. This reveals that the tribe of happiness was not stuck in the past. It too shared in the hope of redemption. The story continues with more names, more pain, and more meaning. And meanwhile, Jacob's family becomes a kind of mirror of all humanity. Desire, rejection, waiting, rivalry, blessing, struggle, gratitude. Each child is born as a response to something, and each name becomes a window to understanding how God works with imperfect stories. In the next section we will delve into the remaining children, the birth of Joseph and Benjamin, how these tribes were scattered and reunited, and how all of this reappears in a surprising way in the final visions of the Bible. The story becomes even richer when we come to the children who complete the family's formation. Until now, each birth seems to have arisen from a specific pain, a comparison, a lack, or an almost desperate hope. But now the narrative gains even greater depth, because the children who come later are no longer just emotional responses. They begin to shape the future of Israel in a way that spans centuries. Rachel, after a long time struggling to conceive, finally sees her own story change. The birth of Joseph is one of those moments when waiting transforms into relief, but also into a harbinger of something greater. The name Joseph carries the idea of adding, of summing up, of making grow. Rachel is not just celebrating a baby. She is confessing hope. She is saying with her son's name that God can still give more. This detail is extremely important because the story of Joseph will reflect exactly this meaning. Joseph is the son who arrives late, but who becomes extraordinary. He is loved by his father, envied by his brothers, sold into slavery, unjustly accused, forgotten in prison, and then exalted to the highest position in Egypt after Pharaoh. In other words, the boy whose name meant God will add, lives a life in which God does exactly that, adds purpose where there seemed to be only loss. The story of Joseph is one of the longest and most remarkable narratives in all of Genesis. And this is no coincidence. The Bible dedicates much space to him because his life serves as a mirror of divine faithfulness amidst suffering. Joseph begins as the favorite son, but ends as the preserver of nations. He begins in his father's lap and ends supporting brothers who betrayed him. He begins under dreams and ends interpreting dreams. He begins rejected and ends ruling. His suffering does not destroy him. On the contrary, it shapes him. When his brothers throw him into the pit and then sell him, it seems that everything is over. But God had something else in mind. When Potiphar receives him and then Potiphar's wife falsely accuses him, it seems that injustice has won. But God was not yet finished. When Joseph is thrown into prison and forgotten by the cupbearer, it seems that human memory has triumphed over hope. But God's timing always comes. And when it arrives, Joseph is lifted from the depths of prison to become the second most powerful man in Egypt. His life shows that the meaning of Ad isn't only fulfilled in the birth of a child. It's also fulfilled in the way God transforms loss into governance. The same man who was violently taken from his father's house goes on to support the entire people during famine. The same rejected son becomes a source of survival for those who despised him. That is why Joseph earns such a special place in biblical memory. He doesn't just represent a tribe, he represents a spiritual logic. God transforms humiliation into authority, delay into maturity, and wound into provision. But the story of Joseph also has another fascinating detail. His two sons come to be counted as full tribes. Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's sons, receive inheritance rights among the tribes of Israel. This means that Joseph, in a way, generates a double portion within the nation. At some points in the Bible he appears as a single tribe. At others, his sons take his place in the total count. The number remains 12, but the names are rearranged according to the context. This flexibility isn't chaos. It's purpose. She shows that God's people are not defined merely by a fixed list, but by a living history. The names may change form, but the promise remains. The heritage is preserved, even if the configuration alters. And this already points to something greater. God does not work bound by human formulas. He honors covenants but also guides history with sovereign freedom. And then comes Rachel's last son, Benjamin. If Joseph is the son of rewarded waiting, Benjamin is the son of the deepest pain. Rachel's childbirth is fatal. She dies giving birth. And in her last moments she names the boy Benoni, son of my sorrow. The name is raw, human, almost unbearable. It records reality without embellishment. But Jacob, the father, intervenes. He does not allow the boy's future to be trapped by the tragedy of his origin. So the name changes to Benjamin, son of the right hand. The contrast between the two names is striking. Benoni speaks of suffering. Benjamin speaks of honor. Benoni describes what happened. Benjamin points to what could still be. It's as if Jacob were saying that pain didn't have to be the final word on that child's life. Rachel's loss was real, but the boy's destiny didn't have to be only mourning. The father chooses a name that paves the way for dignity, strength, and worth. And indeed, Benjamin becomes a significant tribe in the history of Israel. From its ranks would emerge Saul, the nation's first king. And centuries later, there would also be Paul, the apostle who would bring the gospel to many peoples. It is impressive to realize this. The boy whose mother died in childbirth becomes the ancestor of men who would change the course of biblical history. This shows us something very profound. God not only receives the name that pain tries to give him, he can also redirect identity, rewrite the narrative, and transform grief into vocation. When we put the names of the children together one by one, the sequence begins to resemble a spiritual poem. God saw me. God heard me. God has joined me. I will praise. God judges. God strengthens me in the fight. God made me happy. God will reward me. God dwells within me. God adds. Son of my right hand. This doesn't seem like a simple family list. It seems like a confession of faith being built in real time, through a broken home, where each birth became a sentence before heaven. But the story of the tribes doesn't end with Jacob's family. It extends throughout the national history of Israel. After the formation of the people, the moment of political division arrives, and this moment alters everything. After the reign of Solomon, the United Kingdom splits. Rehoboam, his son, refuses to alleviate the burden of tribute, and this leads 10 tribes to separate from the house of David. The north retains the name Israel. The south becomes Judah and Benjamin, while Levi spreads among the people due to his priestly vocation. This rupture is one of the great tragedies of biblical history. The people born from a single family are divided into 2 kingdoms. What was born of promise now lives in fracture. What began as a blessing now bears the scars of politics, idolatry, and disobedience. The north, led by Jeroboam, soon establishes alternative cults, golden calves, and unauthorized religious centers. The result is a gradual distancing from faithfulness to the Lord. And then comes the historical judgment. The northern kingdom falls to Assyria. The population is deported, dispersed, fragmented. The tribes disappear from the political map and enter historical memory as the so-called lost tribes of Israel. This does not mean that individuals of that lineage cease to exist, but as an organized and territorial nation, the north ceases to exist. What remains is memory, dispersion, and the echo of an interrupted history. Judah in turn resists for longer. But it too falls now before Babylon. Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple is burned, and the people go into exile. The difference is that Judah returns after 70 years. The remnant returns, rebuilds, and begins again. That is why in Jesus' time the people are called Jews. The name comes from Judah. The tribe of praise ends up becoming the identity of the entire surviving nation. This historical backdrop is crucial because it shows how the promise transcends collapse. The people fell but were not erased. The division was real, the exile was real, the suffering was real. But the God who gave names to the children also continued to guide the history of their descendants. There is yet another very significant point, the figure of the priest. In the Old Testament, the high priest entered before God carrying 12 precious stones on his chest, each bearing the name of a tribe. This was no ordinary ornament. It was an image laden with meaning. The priest carried the entire people before the Lord. Not on his back like dead weight but on his heart. This speaks volumes about how God wants the covenant to be remembered, with closeness, responsibility, and representation. The tribes, then, are not merely a chapter in genealogy. They are an anticipation of what spiritual mediation points to. They announce a greater reality, in which the presence of God would not be accessed in a distant way, but represented by someone who carries the people within themselves. In the New Testament, this image finds fulfillment in Jesus, the ultimate high priest. He doesn't just enter with stones and engraved names. He intercedes for real people with their pain, guilt, and hopes. What was symbolic becomes reality. What was figurative becomes fulfillment. And this further amplifies the importance of the tribes within the biblical narrative. The next section will move on to the appearances of the tribes in the book of Revelation, to the city with 12 gates, and to what it means to see those names reappearing at the end of all Scripture. When the Bible reaches its final book, much that seems scattered throughout the story reappears in a different form. It's as if the first and last pages are conversing with each other. What began in a family marked by tension, jealousy, and pain ends in a vision of a city, of open doors, of precious stones, and of names engraved forever. And this doesn't happen by chance. The Bible makes a point of showing that what was born in suffering was not discarded along the way. In the book of Revelation, the tribes reappear. And the way they appear is fascinating. In one of the visions, John sees God's servants sealed from the tribes of Israel. The list doesn't exactly follow the more well-known pattern of Genesis. Some tribes appear in different positions, others emerge, others are omitted. This already shows that the text isn't trying to repeat an old table. It's showing purpose, reorganization, and spiritual meaning. Nothing there is random. What is most striking is realizing that Levi, who for a long time was treated differently because of his priestly role, reappears. The tribe set apart for service now appears included. This has enormous symbolic weight. It's as if the barrier between those who served and those who approached has been broken down. The entire people are remembered again before God. At the same time, Dan disappears from this specific list. And this is noteworthy because Dan, whose name was associated with judgment, was one of the tribes later linked to idolatry. Biblical history records that the tribe went down very problematic paths, and this past doesn't completely disappear. Still, Dan's absence from a list doesn't mean definitive erasure. It can be read as a serious sign about the consequences of deviation, but not as the end of the story, because the Bible also shows something else. In the vision of the eternal city described in Revelation, the 12 tribes reappear at the gates of the New Jerusalem. And here the symbolism is too strong to go unnoticed. The tribes are no longer scattered across the political map of an ancient kingdom. They appear as the entrance to the city of God. That is, the story that began in a broken house ends in a perfect dwelling. What began with children named by wounded women ends with names inscribed at the entrance to the divine presence. The doors point in all 4 directions. That's also very beautiful. The image conveys inclusion, direction, and reach. No matter where a person comes from, there is access. No matter their origin, there is an entrance. No matter their history, there is a door. The city is not closed to the world. It is organized to welcome. The tribes become doors, and this says that God's people are not only objects of remembrance but also a path of access. Another crucial layer emerges when the city's foundations are linked to the apostles. The 12 foundations and the 12 gates appear side by side. This shows that the Old and New Testaments do not compete with each other. They meet in a single structure. The tribes represent the gates. The apostles represent the foundations. One points to the other. One prepares the other. One does not eliminate the other. Everything converges towards the same glorious reality. This union between past and future is one of the great beauties of the Bible. The tribes began as families. Then they became a nation. Then they were divided. Then they were exiled. Then they reappeared in prophetic visions. And, in the end, they appear as permanent names on the gates of the holy city. This means that history does not end in fragmentation. It ends in restoration. What was scattered will be reunited. What was wounded will be remembered. What seemed lost will be included again. And this is where the image becomes almost too moving. Imagine a family photo that has been crumpled, folded, moved from place to place, forgotten in drawers, torn at the corners, marked by time. Some faces are somewhat faded. Some edges disappear. But someone takes that photo, carefully smooths it out, frames it, and places it in a place of honor within a house that will never again be destroyed. That is exactly how the story of the tribes seems to work in the final vision of the Bible. Nothing is thrown away. Not even Leah's pain. Not even waiting for Rachel. Not even a dispute between sisters. Not even the instability of kingdoms. Not even exile. Not even the dispersion. Not even the flaws of each tribe. Everything is brought back into the story of God. And perhaps that is the most powerful message of the entire narrative. God does not treat names as if they were disposable. The name he wrote remains. The name he pronounced before birth is not erased by disobedience, nor by crisis, nor by time. Human history may try to erase what God has declared, but it cannot. Therefore, when we read about the tribes, we are reading much more than a tribal genealogy. We are seeing how God deals with real people. We see that he works with broken people, dysfunctional families, delayed promises, and unexpected destinies. We see that he transforms tears into lineage, pain into identity, and shame into inheritance. Leah, for example, never seemed to be the favorite woman in the house. But it was from her that one of the most important lines of Israel came. The ignored woman became the mother of central tribes in biblical history. Rachel, in turn, lived through the anguish of waiting and ended up leaving children who would carry both promise and tragedy. The servants participated in the formation of the nation. Their children occupied the land. Their names entered the memory of Israel. And that speaks to us as well. Because, in some way, every person carries a similar question. What does God do with a life marked by frustrations? What does He do with losses, rejections, and phases that seem meaningless? The story of the tribes answers with a powerful image. He does not waste anything that is given to Him. He takes the raw material of pain and transforms it into something that survives time. That is why the names of the tribes appear so often at such important moments in the Bible. They are not merely a reminder of a distant past. They function as a framework for divine faithfulness. In Genesis they appear as sons. In Exodus they appear on the priest's breastplate. In the history of Israel they occupy lands, form kingdoms, suffer dispersion, and experience judgment. In Revelation they reappear as doors and seals. The beginning and the end touch. And if we look closely, perhaps we will realize that the entire sequence tells a story greater than that of Jacob's own sons. It tells the story of a God who sees, hears, unites, calls to praise, answers struggles, adds, honors, rewards, and opens doors. The sequence of names became a kind of national prayer. And this prayer crossed empires without losing its meaning. In the end, what remains is not the perfection of the tribes. None of them were perfect. There was idolatry, division, conflict, absence, fall, and exile. But the name remained. And the name remaining is one of the strongest forms of hope. Because the name says, you are still part of history. You have not yet been erased. You can still be remembered before God. Jacob began with 12 sons in a confused family. Revelation ends with 12 names engraved on the gates of a glorious city. Between one point and the other, there was betrayal, sin, punishment, preservation, and restoration. And the thread that connects it all is the grace of God, who continues to write where humanity only knows how to erase. If you read this story to the end, you realize that the true protagonist is not just a tribe, nor a family, nor even a nation. The protagonist is the God who does not abandon what He has chosen. He was faithful when Leah felt invisible. He was faithful when Rachel wept. He was faithful when Israel was divided. He was faithful when the people were exiled. And He remains faithful when the names reappear on the gates of the eternal city. That is the power of history. She says that suffering doesn't have the final word. She says that rejection doesn't define destiny. She says that dispersal is not the end. She says that God still knows where to place each name. And when the final city opens, when the gates gleam, when the foundations stand firm, when the names are engraved there forever, it becomes clear that what began with tears ended in glory.